Not just any theatre, but one of those grand, sprawling London venues in 8877. Picture the red velvet curtains cascading down like thick, heavy blood, the gaslit chandeliers hissing softly above, and the scent, a pungent, suffocating mixture of expensive lavender water, damp wool, and the faint chemical sweetness of gas jets burning. The audience is in their Sunday best, men in top hats, women in rustling silk, waiting for the show to begin. Now look at the stage. It is not filled with actors or acrobats, but with people who never asked to be there. There is a man 7 feet tall, his bones aching with every agonizing step he takes. A woman stands in the shadows, her skin patterned in ways Victorian doctors called extraordinary, and the common crowds labelled monstrous. In the corner, a 12-year-old boy, born without arms, holds a quill between his toes to write his name, while 200 people cheer and clap, not for the art, but for the tragedy. But that is not the dark part. The dark part is the sign hanging above the door. In aid of the Metropolitan Society for Charitable Relief of Afflicted Persons. Charity, they called it charity. Welcome to Victorian London, 1877, a city of 4 million souls, the beating heart of an empire that spans a quarter of the globe. A city that builds the most advanced hospitals on earth, yet charges admission to gawk at the sick. A city that weeps at a sermon about the poor on Sunday morning and pays 6 pence on Saturday night to watch a person with a disability eat their supper. We're going back there tonight, but we are not going as visitors, and we are certainly not going as the audience in the velvet seats. We are going to stand on that stage. We will see what they saw, smell what they smelled, and feel the weight of a world where your very existence is a commodity. You feel the look before you hear a word. It starts in the eyes of the passer-by, a slight widening, a fraction of a second of pure involuntary shock. Before their sociamenery kicks in, before they remember their manners and look away, you see it, that moment of calculation. You are not a person to them, you are a curiosity, a variable in their narrow world. The channel's Sleepy History with Benedict is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, and the promotion of positive emotional values. The air in London doesn't just hold moisture, it holds weight. In 8877, the city was the greatest, most terrifying industry engine the world had ever seen. The Thames was a churning artery of commerce, and the streets were paved with the ambition of millions. But for those who didn't fit the mechanical perfection of the factory floor, the city had no room. Think about the life of an ordinary worker, a printer on Cheapside, a weaver in the mills. Your worth was measured in productivity, how many hours you could stand, how much weight you could carry, how fast your hands could move. If your body deviated from that standard, if you were too tall, too short, if a limb was missing, or if a birthmark stained your skin, you weren't just different, you were considered unfit. And in Victorian Britain, unfit was a dangerous word. It was the precursor to the workhouse, a place where families were torn apart and dignity was stripped away as a prerequisite for a bowl of gruel. This is where the charity machine stepped in. It was a clever, cynical bridge. The middle class, burdened by a mix of genuine religious guilt and a voyeuristic hunger, need a way to feel benevolent without actually changing the system. If they ignored you, they felt guilty. If they employed you, they feared your weakness would slow down production. But if they put you on a stage, labelled you as an afflicted object of sympathy, they solved both problems. You weren't begging on the street, which was considered a moral failing. Instead, you were being displayed. The managers of these exhibition halls understood this psychology perfectly. They didn't sell tickets to a show. They sold tickets to a lesson in gratitude. They curated your appearance, gave you a stage, and wrapped your suffering in the comforting, moralistic language of the church. They knew that if a gentleman felt he was doing a good deed by paying his sixpence, he wouldn't feel the sting of shame when he stared at you. He would feel like a hero. So you were taught to stand still. You were taught to perform your affliction in a way that didn't threaten the audience, but rather confirmed their own relative health and prosperity. They were looking at you, but they were actually looking at them's, mirroring their own fears of poverty and physical frailty through the glass of your existence. The streets outside, with their relentless noise and their crushing pace, seemed to demand a version of you that simply didn't exist. You were a puzzle piece forced into a machine that was never designed for your shape. And as the fog rolled in from the river, muffling the clop of horse, drawn carriages, you had to decide. Do you fight the label they'd given you, or do you wear it like a costume to survive the night? You are walking toward the East End. The streets here are different, narrower, older, the buildings leaning in toward each other like conspirators whispering secrets in the dark. The smell is river mud, coal smoke, and the sour ghost of refuse left to rot in the gutters. You are here to meet Greer, the man who runs the Metropolitan Exhibition Hall. He found you in a coffee house, his eyes calculating the moment they landed on you, not with pity, but with the cold, professional appraisal of a man gauging the value of a prize horse. The hall is tucked between a pawnbroker's shop and a gin palace on a side street off Tooley. When you walk inside, the transition is jarring. The damp, grey whirl of London vanishes, replaced by a stage reality. The walls are painted a deep, artificial burgundy, a colour meant to suggest the luxury of a gentleman's study, though it's clearly peeling and cheap under the flicker of the gaslights. Greer doesn't welcome you as a guest. He welcomes you as an asset. He introduces you to the others, the ones who have already been broken in the rhythm of the hall. There is Eliza, who has been here for 2 years, sitting by a fake hearth with a piece of mending that never seems to get finished. There is William, the tallest man you've ever seen, who has to stoop because the ceiling wasn't built for his height. And there are the Conley brothers, always together, always performing the silence that the crowd expects. They don't look at you with the typical pained curiosity of a stranger on the street. Theirs is a professional assessment. What are you? Is your condition rare enough? Can you hold a pose for 3 hours without complaining? You realise then that this isn't a shelter, it isn't a refuge, it is a stage. You are provided with a small roped off square, a 3-foot-high wooden railing. It's not a cage, at least. Not in the way a zoo would call it a cage, but it functions exactly the same way. It defines the boundary between the normal and the spectacle. Greer instructs you to wear your coat, but to keep the scars exposed. He tells you where to sit, how to position your hands so the light catches your deformities, and most importantly, what to say when a customer asks a question. You aren't allowed to complain about the cold or the ache in your joints. You are instructed to be grateful for the charity of the society that protects you from the harshness of the streets. The tragedy isn't that you are being looked at. The tragedy is that for the first time in your life, you are being forced to narrate your own suffering according to someone else's script. You are learning the language of the Victorian freak show, where the truth is less important than the story. The audience wants to hear a story where you are the silent, grateful recipient of their condescending mercy. The hours drag on like a slow, rhythmic torture. When the doors finally open, the first of the public trickle in. They don't walk in like people visiting a museum. They walk in like people entering a parlour where they are entitled to touch everything with their eyes. You stand by your railing. You learn to recognise the types. First, there are the pious observers. They carry small leather-bound prayer books and move with a deliberate performative sadness. They will stop in front of you, sigh deeply and whisper to their companions about the mysterious ways of providence. They treat your existence as a moral test for them's. When they toss a coin into the collection box, they aren't helping you. They are buying an indulgence, a way to convince their own souls that they are good, God-fearing people. Then there are the investigators. These are the ones who lean in too close. Their breath smell of gin or tobacco. They want to see the mechanics of your condition. They might ask in a tone meant to be polite, but which is entirely clinical if you feel pain, or if you were born like that. They don't want to know your name, or your history, or the fact that you once held a job as a printer or a clerk. They want to know the anatomy of the unusual. To them, you are a piece of living medical trivia, a curiosity that proves they are whole and normal. And finally, there are the children. They are the most honest, and therefore the most wounding. They stare with unadulterated, wide-eyed wonder. Their parents pull them away, murmuring about manners, but you can see the curiosity that the adults are trying to bury. The irony is that the children are the only ones who truly see a human being. The adults have already learned to overlay that human with a filter of pity, revulsion and superiority. You watch Greer watching them. He is counting the coins. He is gauging which of you draws the biggest crowd, which of you tells the best story of hardship that moves the hearts and opens the purses of the middle class. He is the director of this theatre of the grotesque, and you are just the scenery. You realise that the charity being collected isn't for your metal bills, your comfort, or your future. It is for the maintenance of the hall, for the salaries of the collectors, and for the vanity of the donors. The harder you perform your affliction, the more they give. The more you suffer, the more they feel. It is a closed loop of misery where your survival depends on your ability to remain a spectacle. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Benedict, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes inspired by real events, figures and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or document cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. When the gaslights flicker low at the end of the day, a strange unspoken camaraderie settles over the room. We are a collection of castaways, people who were deemed too heavy a burden for the outside world to carry. William the giant sometimes moves his bench closer to the fire. His knees pop with the sound of dry wood snapping, and he winces, but he never cries out. He was once a carpenter before his condition made his movements too slow for the pace of the workshop. He talks to me in whispers, only when Greer is busy counting the evenings take in his back office. "They don't see us," he murmurs, his voice a deep, gravelly vibration that barely disturbs the air. They see the sign, the story, the pity, but they don't see the man who knows how to mend a chair or the woman who knows the poetry of the seasons. We share small, illicit comforts, a crust of bread saved from the morning, a scrap of newspaper to read by the dim glow of the embers. In these quiet moments, the afflicted label falls away. We are just people trying to survive the night in a city that treats us like ghosts. It is a reminder that even in the most dehumanizing systems, human connection persists. We are not just spectacle, we are survivors. We have our own jokes, our own silent languages, and our own way of mourning the lives we lost before the exhibition hall consumed them. If you find yourself moved by these stories of the forgotten, please consider hitting the subscribe button and ringing the notification bell. By joining our community at Sleepy History with Benedict, you help us continue to bring these hidden, intricate narratives of the past to life. Your support keeps the research, the storytelling, and the journey into history alive. It means more than just a click. It means acknowledging the stories of those who, for too long, were silent by the march of time. Thank you for being a part of this exploration in the shadows of the Victorian era. We are, in essence, a secret society within a society. We know the truth of the metropolitan society, and we know that if any of us were to leave, the city would swallow us whole. So we stay. We play our parts, we wear the labels, and in the dark we remember who we were before we became charity. Outside the burgundy, painted walls of our exhibition hall, London is bracing for one of the harshest winters in memory. The Thames is thick with slush. That Taurus, yellow pea supper, clings to the bricks, seeping in the marrow of anyone forced to spend the night on the cobbles. We are lucky in a bitter, ironic way. We have a roof and we have a fire. The coals are expensive, and Greer grumbles about the cost every time he tosses a fresh shovel load into the grate. But for us, that fire is the only thing standing between us and the absolute indifference of the city. In the evenings, when the last of the Gawkers has finally left, the silence that descends is almost physical. It is heavy, expectant, and deeply lonely. You sit there, watching the coals shift, the only sound in the room. This is when the memories of the before time surface, unbidden. You think of the printer's shop in Cheapside, the smell of fresh ink on paper, the mechanical click-clack of the press, a rhythm that made sense. You think of the life you had before the look became your prime occupation. You realize that the city outside is a vast, unthinking machine that doesn't care if you live or die. It is filled with people scurrying toward their own futures, heads down, eyes fixed on their own survival. They are terrified of being like us, because in their world, to be unlike is to be discarded. The irony is not lost on you. To survive, we are here, forming our difference. Outside, millions are working them to death, trying to prove their uniformity, terrified of any deviation that might lead them to our doorstep. We are the mirror they refuse to look into. William, the giant, breaks the silence tonight. He speaks of the countryside, the real countryside, before the smoke of the factory swallowed the stars. He describes the way the light hits the fields in autumn, a memory so vivid it makes your chest ache. We aren't talking about our medical conditions. We aren't talking about the charity we are supposed receiving. We are talking about the things that made us feel human. In the shadows of the hall, among the velvet drapes that smell of dust and the faint lingering scent of cheap perfume left by the audience, we are a small, fragile resistance. We are reclaiming our existence piece by piece, even if only for a few hours before the dawn forces us back into our roles. The city is cold, the system is cruel, but here, around the dying embers, we are warm enough. For tonight, that is enough. It wasn't just the public who came to stare. Sometimes there were others, men in starch, white collars, carrying leather satchels and pocket watches that tick with a rhythmic, impatient urgency. They were the doctors, the men of science. They didn't pay the sixpence at the door. They had arrangements with Greer. They would walk in with an air of clinical detachment, their eyes scanning us like a naturalist examining specimens in a glass jar. They would speak in hushed, Latinate tones, using words that sounded precise and cold, stripping away our humanity too. Focus on our bone structure, our skin texture, the way our bodies defied their narrow, textbook definition of health. Observe the spinal curvature, one might say, pointing a gloved finger at a young woman who was forced to stand frozen in place. A classic case of congenital deformity. They never asked about our dreams, our pain, or the nightmares that kept us awake in the dark. To them, we were not people. We were walking, breathing medical anomalies. They would take notes, sometimes sketch us, and then go back to their comfortable homes in Harley Street to write papers about us, papers that would be read at the Royal Society or discussed over sherry in private clubs, further cementing the idea that we were something to be studied rather than supported. I remember one doctor, a man with cold, watery blue eyes, who spent an entire hour examining William. He treated William like a piece of architecture, measuring his limbs with a brass caliper. He spoke to Greer as if William wasn't even in the room, discussing the statistical likelihood of such physical proportions being passed down. William stood there, his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on a crack in the peeling burgundy wallpaper, enduring it with a dignity that the doctor was completely blind to. The most bitter part of it, they claimed they were advancing medicine. They claimed their observations might one day lead to a cure, but we knew the truth. There was no intent to heal us. There was no medical care provided for our ailments, no medicine for our aches, no adjustments to make our lives easier. They were simply mapping the geography of our misfortune to satisfy their own intellectual vanity. The system was perfect designed. The public gawked because they were curious. The donors gave because they were guilty. And the doctors observed because they were arrogant. And through it all, we were the foundation upon which their entire edifice of superiority was built. Every time they touched us, or measured us, or wrote about us, they were defining them as the normal ones, the superior ones, the standard by which all of humanity should be judged. And we, the afflicted, were merely the shadow they cast against the wall. There comes a moment when you realize that the most dangerous thing you can do, the most rebellious act possible, is to refuse to let them own your interior life. Greer can control where you stand, he can control what you wear, and he can even control the lighting that exposes your scars, but he cannot touch the place inside where your memories live. You start to cultivate a secret self. During the hours of the exhibition, while the crowds fly past like a slow-moving river of grey coats and judgmental eyes, you retreat in the archives of your own mind. You revisit the smell of the printing ink from your old life. You replay the sound of a mother's voice or the feeling of walking in an open field, unencumbered by the heavy stage, managed weight of your affliction. It is a form of mental escape that keeps you sane. Even as the patrons point their walking sticks at you or whisper their hollow "God bless yous," you are thousands of miles away, standing on a dock at the seaside, feeling the salt spray on your face. You are the architect of your own sanctuary, a place with no burgundy walls and no admission fee. This resilience is not just about survival, it is about reclaiming your narrative. We are often told that history is written by the victors, by the ones who stand on the podium and preach to the masses. But the truth is, history lives in the breaths taken by those who were told they didn't matter. It lives in the small silent acts of dignity that the records of the Victorian era chose to ignore. As we continue this journey through the dark corridors of the past, I want to thank you for choosing to walk alongside me. If these stories have sparked a desire to learn more about the voices that history left in the shadows, please take a moment to like this video, and share it with someone who values the deeper, untold human perspective of history. Your engagement is the bridge that allows us to bypass the grand, cold narratives of the past and reach the beating human heart of it. By sharing, you are helping to turn the light on stories that were meant to be forgotten. We are all of us, shaped by the story of we tell ourselves. In the hall, we tell the story of the afflicted to the patrons to keep the fire burning. But in the quiet of the night, we tell each other the stories of who we truly are, the carpenter, the poet, the dreamer, and in that telling, we are no longer spectacles. We are human beings standing tall even when the world forces us to bow. January 1878 arrived with a brutal biting frost that turned the Thames into jagged landscape ice floes. But even the deepest winter cannot hold back the ineffable turn of the earth. As the weeks dragged on, the light in the afternoons began to stretch just a little bit further, clinging to the dusty window panes of our hall long after the tea hour. With the changing light came a subtle shift in the room. The exhaustion that usually acted as a heavy shroud began to lift, replaced by a jagged, sharp-edged emotion. Resentment. For months we had played the roles assigned to us. We had been the patient sufferer, the grateful recipient, the monstrous marvel. We had swallowed our bitterness like medicine, believing that this was the only way to earn our place by the fire. But the thaw brought a new, dangerous revelation. We were not just watching the world change through the gap in the velvet curtains. We were beginning to understand our own power within the performance. He watched Eliza one afternoon, a wealthy woman in furs, made an offhand, cruel comment about Eliza's inability to perform a simple task. Usually Eliza would have lowered her head and offered a polite, practiced smile, the smile that sold tickets, but that day she did something different. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. She stared directly in the woman's eyes with a cold, piercing tensity that made the woman recoil as if she had been slapped. It was a tiny act. It lasted less than 3 seconds, but it hung in the air like a thunderclap. The woman hurried away, her composure shattered by the simple human defiance of a woman who refused to be a toy. That moment became the seed of a quiet uprising. We began to reclaim our eyes. We began to look back at the audience, not as a source of charity, but as a collection of individuals who were just as lost, just as scared, and just as fragile as we were. The Metropolitan Society sign above the door suddenly felt flimsy, like a mask that was failing to cover the ugly truth of what was really happening here. We were still in the hall, yes. We were still being watched, yes. But the internal landscape had shifted. We were no longer just the people being looked at. We were becoming the ones who were doing the looking. And that, in the eyes of the masters of the hall, was the most dangerous transition of all. The power of the exhibition was built on a fragile foundation, the assumption that we would never look back. The audience relied on the distance between us, a distance kept wide by class, by clothing, by the societal architecture of charity. But as the days lengthened in February, that distance began to shrink, not because we moved, but because our presence became too heavy to ignore. One afternoon, the hall was unusually quiet. The air, thick with the smell of coal and old dust, felt charged, as if a storm were gathering behind the burgundy drapes. I found myself locking eyes with a gentleman in a tailored wool coat. He was looking at my hands, his mouth slightly open, ready to offer some rehearsed platitude about how brave I was to endure such a burden. But he never spoke the words. I didn't look down. I didn't shift away. I held his gaze with a terrifying calm curiosity of my own. I saw his reflection in my eyes, a man who was just as trapped in his own expectations as I was in this hall. He looked confused, then uncomfortable, and finally he looked away, defeated by the sheer act of being treated as a human equal. We were breaking the script. We were no longer characters in their moral play. We were fellow humans in a shared space. If you are finding this exploration of history compelling, I invite you to leave a comment below. What do you think is the most haunting aspect of how Victorian society treated those they deemed unfit? Do you see parallels in our modern world, where the way we watch and interact with others is still shaped by hidden biases? Your perspectives add a vital layer to this conversation, and I read every single one. Let us dissect these historical layers together. This subtle defiance was spreading. William began to stand taller, his height no longer a point of shame but a symbol of presence. Eliza stopped mending her rags and started reading a discarded newspaper, the ink staining her fingers, a visual reminder that we had minds that were hungrier than our stomachs. The managers, the ones who counted the sixpences, were starting to notice. They felt the change in the atmosphere. The charity machine was stuttering. When you treat people like objects, you rely on their compliance. But when an object starts to look back, starts to judge, starts to possess a soul, the whole mechanism begins to grind to a halt. We were coming human again. And for the people who profited from our display, that was the ultimate failure of their system. The most dangerous weapon in Victorian London wasn't a sword or a law, it was the ability to hold a pen. As the frost began to recede from the windows of the hall, the atmosphere within changed. We weren't just waiting for the next audience, we were waiting for the chance to tell our own side of the story. Eliza had managed to hoard scraps of paper, notices, discarded flyers, the back of used envelopes from the trash the attendants left behind. In the dead of night, by the flickering light of the last embers in the hearth, she began to write. She didn't write about her deformity, and she didn't write about the charity that paid for her bread. She wrote about her life in the village before the city took her, about the smell of rain on dry soil, and the way the birds sounded in the early morning. When she showed me her pages, the words felt like a rebellion. She was naming her world, and in naming it, she was reclaiming it. We were no longer just characters in a spectacle orchestrated by Greer. We were historians of our own existence. This is the great unspoken fear of any system that thrives on dehumanization, that the others might start to speak for thems. If the world heard our voices, if they realized that we were mothers, carpenters, poets and thinkers, the freak show would lose its power. You cannot view a human being as a monster if you are reading their poems, if you are hearing their laugh, if you understand their childhood memories. We started sharing these fragments with one another, a story told in a whisper, a memory described in a few hurried lines on a scrap of paper. We were building a shared history, a secret archive that existed beneath the floorboards of the exhibition hall. It was our way of saying we were here, we were human, we were more than the sixpence you paid to look at us. The system was beginning to feel fragile, not because of some grand, violent revolution, but because of this quiet, persistent act of remembering. We were filling the silence with our own truths, and that sound was louder than any of the gasps or cheers of the crowds that passed us by. The burgundy walls didn't seem quite so imposing anymore. They were just wallpaper, and we were the ones behind them, waiting for the right moment to turn the page. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for education and teaching purposes. Greer sensed the shift. He was a man who lived by the pulse of the room, and he knew that the atmosphere had soured. The money was still coming in, but the energy of the hall had changed, from a place of docile performance to one of unspoken, simmering tension. He began to crack the whip, figuratively speaking. He demanded more drama, more of the exaggerated movements, more of the tragedy that the audience craved. "You, Thomas," he barked at me one afternoon, his face flushed with the exertion of maintaining his own persona of the benevolent guardian. "You need to walk more slowly. Make them see the pain. Make them feel it. They aren't paying to see a man who carries his weight with such indifference." I didn't nod. I didn't perform the slow, agonizing shuffle he wanted. I just held his gaze, my back straight, my movements fluid and deliberate. It was a direct insult to his authority, a violation of the unspoken contract that kept us fed and housed. His voice, a low, threatening rasp. "Do not forget who provides your shelter. Do not forget that out there you are nothing but a beggar, a stray dog to be kicked into the river." He was right, of course. That was the terror he wielded, but his power was predicated on our fear, and fear, as it turns out, is a resource that can be exhausted. By demanding more, by trying to squeeze every last drop of pity out of us for the sake of his ledger, he was inadvertent pushing us toward the edge of rebellion. Eliza, sitting by her faux hearth, stopped her mending entirely. She simply folded her hands in her lap and stared at the wall. The Conley brothers, usually so compliant, moved with a sudden sharp efficiency that felt less like performance and more like a warning. Even William, the giant, ceased his stooping. He stood at his full imposing height, his shadow casting a long dark line across the stage, effectively dwarfing Greer. The audience, sensing this shift in dynamic, began to grow uneasy. They hadn't come for a confrontation. They had come to be reassured. When the monsters start to look like men, when the curiosities start to display a will of their own, the spell is broken. The room felt heavy with the pressure of the unspoken, a vacuum where the performance was supposed to be. We were no longer just people standing behind a railing. We were a collective force of quiet, immovable dissent. And for the first time, Greer looked not like a manager, but like a man who had lost control of his own machine. The farce was fraying at the edges, and we were the ones pulling at the threads. It wasn't just us changing. The city itself was becoming restless. Outside, the London papers were beginning to carry whispers of reform. There were articles about the squalor of the workhouses, stories about the dignity of the poor, and debates about the morality of treating human beings as display for the amusement of the idle rich. These papers, often smuggled into our hall by sympathetic cleaner or even some of the more thoughtful patrons, became our lifeline to the outside. We read about figures and movements we had never heard of before. There were reformers, journalists, and even a few radical thinkers who dared to question the very systems that kept the exhibition halls in business. They spoke of rights, of personhood, and of the fundamental cruelty of the charity industry. "Listen to this," William would murmur, his voice barely a breath, as he held a torn page from a radical broadsheet. He would read about a public demonstration in the West End, a gathering of people standing up for their rights. It sounded impossible, almost like a dream, yet the words were printed in black and white. It was proof that the world was larger than our Burgundy, walled room. For Greer, this was a catastrophe. He grew more agitated, hovering over the entrance, checking the faces of the crowd. Fearful that an inspector or a firebrand journalist might walk through the doors and dismantle his carefully curated illusion, his desperation turned the hall into a place of paranoia. He began to restrict our access to outside information, pulling the newspapers away. forbidding the Connolly brothers from talking to the janitors. But you can't stop the flow of a river, and you certainly can't stop the spread of an idea. We already knew. We knew that out there, in the vast chaotic sprawl of London, there were people who looked us and saw, not an object to be gawked at, but a human being deserving of respect. The realization was a turning point. Our compliance was no longer a matter of survival, it was a matter of strategy. We learned to hide our defiance behind a mask of exhaustion, all while secretly planning for a day when the doors would open, not for an audience to walk in, but for us to walk out. The hall was no longer our world, it was a temporary waiting room. And for the first time, we weren't just waiting for the day to end, we were waiting for the era of the spectacle to come to its inevitable messy end. The atmosphere in the hall had shifted from one of quiet resentment to a palpable electric hum of anticipation. We were no longer simply living in the moment. We were planning for the future. The burgundy walls, once the boundaries of our entire universe, now felt like the paper, thin partitions of a stage, set ready to be torn down. Greer was losing his grip. He had started to sense that the energy in the room was no longer his to command. The patrons, too, seemed to sense it. There was a discomfort in the air, the feeling of being in a room where you are no longer the one in control. The audience would enter, look at us, and instead of finding the passive great figs they expected, they met eyes that were steady, assessing, and entirely unbothered by their presence. Eliza had gathered enough paper scraps to fill a small hidden satchel. William had begun to stand fully upright, his presence filling the room in a way that made the visitors feel small, rather than the other way around. We spoke in code, a language of glances and small, deliberate actions that excluded the world of the patrons entirely. "We are not going to be here when the next season turns," William whispered one evening, his voice steady as iron. It wasn't a wish, it was a decision. The weight of our condition, the years of medical scrutiny, the labels of afflicted, all of it felt like an old heavy coat that we were preparing to cast off. We realized that our charity had been an illusion, a transactional trap designed to keep us hidden in plain sight. But we had learned the truth of our own value. We had learned that we were not merely the sum of our limitations, nor the reflection of a society's distorted pity. I looked around the room, at the flickering gaslight, the velvet drapes, the railing that had defined my life for these last months. It seemed so fragile now. The entire structure of the Metropolis Exhibition Hall was built on the premise of our silence. And as we stood there together, a silent, unified front of people who had decided that their stories belonged to them alone, I realized that the silence was finally about to break. The night was long, and the Faust time was thick, but for the first time in years, the future didn't look like a dark, infinite stretch of the same. It looked like an open door. We were ready. Not for the approval of the crowds, not for the coins of the charitable, but for the uncertainty and the challenge of a life that was finally truly our own. The dawn of the final day in the hall arrived with a pale grey light that bled through the heavy curtains, turning the burgundy walls to the colour of dried blood. Greer was bustling, his movements frantic as he prepared for the morning rush of patrons. His counting the collection boxes, his hand shaking slightly, sensing the cold, collective stillness that radiated from us. He looked at me, his eyes darting to William, then to Eliza. He opened his mouth to give a command, but no sound came out. The air in the room was too heavy, too thick with the weight of our silence. We were standing in our usual spots, but we were not forming, we were not stooping, we were not offering the practiced, tragic smiles. We were simply standing, human beings, complete and unyielding. The first patrons began to filter in, their voices muffled by the heavy velvet. They stopped expecting the show. They looked at us, waiting for the filial narrative of suffering and gratitude. When they met only our steady, unblinking gazes, the room, which for so long had been a place of exploitation, suddenly became a place of profound and comfortable truth. The social need to shout, or fight, or tear down the walls. We simply ceased to be there, afflicted. We reclaimed our own humanity, and by doing so we rendered their power obsolete. Greer shouted, but his voice sounded thin and meaningless in the vast, echoing space. It was the sound of a man screaming into the wind. We didn't look at him. We looked at each other. A nod from William, a quiet knowing smile from Eliza. It was the signal. We turned not toward the spectres, but toward the exit, the heavy brass-handled door that led not to the safety of the workhouse or the charity of the society, but to the unpredictable, chaotic, beautiful freedom of London streets. As we walked, the railing felt like nothing more than a scrap of wood. The burgundy walls fell away behind us. We stepped out in the cold, sharp air of February, the fog swirl around our feet like a retreating tide. The city was still there, vast and indifferent, but it no longer held the power to define us. The tall man, the woman with the scarred skin, the man who was once a printer, moving as a unit, a small, quiet, persistent force of existence. We didn't know where we were going, or how we would survive the next hour, let alone the rest of our lives. But for the first time, every step we took was our own. We were no longer characters in their story, we were the authors of our own. The spectacle had ended, and the life, the messy, unscripted, human life, had finally begun. Stepping out of the exhibition hall felt like walking from a stagnant pool in the cold, rushing current of the Thames. The London we stepped into was in the midst of a profound, agonizing transformation. It was 8878, and the rigid moral hierarchies that had defined the mid-Victorian era were starting to crack under the weight of their own contradictions. For years we had lived inside the charity delusion, believing we were isolated anomalies, but out on the streets we began to see the threads of a different story. London was a city of paradoxes. The same city that institutionalized freak shows was also beginning to grapple with the early, tentative movements of the Charity Reform Acts and debates around the lunacy laws. There were public lectures in town halls about the rights of the underprivileged. There were quiet, radical pamphlets being distributed in the back rooms of coffee houses, not just about politics, but about what it meant to be a human being with agency in an industrial age. We saw men and women walking with a new kind of purpose, the early advocates of social reform who recognized that the affliction of the body was not a moral failing of the soul, but a reality of the human condition. We realized that our exodus from the hall wasn't just a personal escape, it was a microcosm of what was happening across the nation. The Victorian obsession with classification, the need to label, measure, and box every citizen into neat, useful category was failing. The sheer mass of humanity in a city of 4 million people defied such simple labels. We found work not in exhibition halls, but in the hidden bustling corners of the city that didn't demand we be spectacles. William found employment in a workshop that valued his strength more than it questioned his proportions. Eliza, with her sharp mind and her smuggled scraps of paper, began to find a voice among the small independent presses. We were no longer the afflicted nor the charitable objects. We were simply Londoners, part of the soot-stained, vibrant, messy, and infinitely complex tapestry of the city. But the memory of the hall remained, a ghostly reminder of a time when society thought it could own the truth of our bodies. And in the quiet moments of the evening, when the fog turned the gaslight into soft amber hellos, we knew that our real story, the one we were currently writing, was the most radical act of all. Freedom, we quickly learned, was not the absence of judgment. It was simply the absence of a stage. Walking through the streets of London, the old habit of the look was still there. People on the omnibuses, shopkeepers in their stalls, the brisk clerks rushing toward the city, they still turned their heads. They still caught that fractional second of surprise before their social manners smoothed over their expressions. But now it was different. When someone stared, we didn't lower our eyes. We didn't shift to show our best angle for a hypothetical audience. We simply walked. We went to the markets to buy bread. We navigated the crowded thoroughfares. We queued for the water pumps. We were acting like everyone else, because in truth, we were exactly like everyone else. Just people trying to get from one point to the other before the rain began to fall. The real challenge wasn't the stairs. It was the systems that hadn't been built for us. The high counters in the shops, the narrow entrances to the public houses, the rigid hours of the workday that took no account of physical exhaustion or the simple human need to rest. We were constantly reminded that the architecture of London, both physical and social, was built for a standard body that most people, if they lived long enough, would eventually fail to meet. Yet there was an exhilaration in this struggle. Every time I reached for a shelf that was just slight too high, or navigated a flight of stairs that took twice the effort, I was reclaiming a piece of my own agency. I was no longer an exhibit in a burgundy, walled room. I was a person with a life that required navigation. We start to notice others like us, not in cages, not on stages, but working as street sweepers, as seamstresses in back rooms, as messengers. We were everywhere. We were the hidden lifeblood of the city, working twice as hard to occupy the same space. The divide was no longer between the exhibited and the audience. It was between those who believed the world was fixed and those of us who knew it was malleable. Every day was a small, quiet negotiation with the city, and as the spring turned the Thames to a deeper, clearer blue, we felt the city begin to accept us, not with the performative charity of the whole, but with the weary, distracted acceptance that London reserved for all its inhabitants. We were finally just part of the background noise of the greatest city on earth. As the months passed and we became more deeply embedded in the rhythm of the city, we began to notice a shift in how the world around us spoke of difference. The Victorian era was, after all, a period of frantic cataloguing. Everything had to be named, categorized, and filed away. The Royal College of Surgeons was expanding, and medical journals were overflowing with detailed descriptions of condition that once would have landed a person directly in a freak show. We saw these papers sometimes. In the public reading rooms, where we would shelter from the rain, we would encounter discussions about the Sturge-Weber syndrome or the nuance of physical growth. The language was cold, detached, and clinical, but it was different from the charity talk of the exhibition hall. It was an attempt to understand, not to exploit. However, the irony was never lost on us. While the doctors were learning more, they were still fundamentally detached from the people they studied. They saw a case, not a life. They saw a set of symptoms, not a person who liked their tea a certain way or who worried about the rising cost of coal. We understood then that the battle for our dignity was not just about escaping the hall, it was about defining ourselves against both the pity of the charity mongers and the clinical detachment of the medical establishment. We began to realize that true liberation meant being seen as neither a tragedy to be pitied nor a specimen to be analyzed, but as a person with a story that existed independently of our physical form. It was a quiet, intellectual rebellion. We started to frequent the lectures at the Working Men's College. We listened to debates about Darwin, about the evolution of society, about the shifting moral foundations of an empire that was beginning to suspect its own dominance might not be as natural as it once thought. In the lecture halls, surrounded by people who were just as curious, just as flawed, and just as searching as we were, the shadow of the burgundy walls seemed to grow fainter. We were no longer outliers, we were participants. We were living proof that the human spirit, the one that yearned to learn, to contribute, and to be understood, was far more resilient than any system of categorization could ever be. We were witnessing the birth of a new kind of social awareness, one where the focus was beginning to shift from what a body looked like to what a human being could become. London, with all its strawl and its indifference, possessed a strange quality. It was a city of hidden connections. Once we stopped being spectacles, we began to notice the others. We saw them in the back rows of the libraries, in the crowd corners of the markets, and in the quiet, draughty churches of the East End. They were the people who, like us, had been cast out by the rigid expectations of the factory floor or the medical ledger. We didn't call ours a movement. We were just a network of individuals who understood that the city was not a monolith. It was a collection of stories, and some of those stories were being forcibly muted. Eliza started organising small meetings in a dry, cramped attic above a baker's shop in Whitechapel. It wasn't anything grand. We would gather, sometimes only 4 or 5 of us, to share news, to help one another find work that didn't, demand physical perfection, and to trade the fragments of information we gleaned from the city's newspapers. We shared tips on which employers were less likely to discriminate, which workhouses were marginally more humane, and where one could find a moment of peace without being accosted. This was the birth of a genuine organic resistance. It wasn't fought with banners or grand speeches. It was fought with the quiet, stubborn persistence of people who refused to be erased. We were learning to navigate the city's bureaucracy, to advocate for one another, and to build a small, fragile safety net that didn't rely on the charity of society, that only wanted to profit from our misfortune. You remember one night, as we sat in that attic, the air thick with the smell of baking bread from below, William spoke of the future. He didn't talk about a revolution. He talked about a time when people like us wouldn't have to hide. He talked about a city that could accommodate all its citizens, not just the ones who fit the mould. It was a radical thought in 8878, a year still dominated by the grinding gears of industrial utility. We were the grit in the machine. We were the people who, by our mere presence in the city, were forcing the society to adjust its own definition of normal. Every time we held a job, every time we walked down a street, every time we claimed our own space, we were making it slightly harder for the next generation to be shoved into a cage of velvet and gaslight. We were not just surviving. We were slowly, painstakingly creating a world where the spectacle was no longer the only way to be seen. The transition from object of spectacle to citizen of London was not a sudden explosion, but a slow tectonic shift. It was felt in the small interaction that populate the daily life of a sprawling metropolis. I remember a day when William, now working regular craft in a small neighbourhood shop, was seen by a man who had visited the exhibition hall months prior. The man recognized him. He stopped on the sidewalk, his brow furrowed, caught between the memory of the giant in thee. burgundy, walled hall, and the reality of a man engaged in the quiet, precise work of repairing fine furniture. That moment of recognition was pivotal. It forced the bystander to confront the dissonance in his own mind. Was William a curiosity, or was he a neighbour? As he watched William interact with the shopkeeper, speaking with the authority of someone who mastered his trade, the man's expression shifted from voyeuristic curiosity to a grudging, then genuine respect. It was happening everywhere. Eliza, through her writing, had begun to contribute articles to small, local gazettes. She wrote under a pseudonym, but her insight in the life of the working class and the hidden struggles of those with disabilities began to gain a quiet following. People read her words and felt a prick of conscience. They started to see the people around them, not as afflicted types to be avoided or gawked at, but as individuals whose lives were as rich, as frustrating, and as precious as their own. We were breaking the lens through which London had viewed the different. We were forcing them to see the humanity that had always been there, obscured by the gaslight and the velvet curtains. This, I realized, was the true power of our exodus. We were proving that the freak show was never a reflection of reality, but a reflection of the audience's own limitations. The more we lived openly, the more we occupied the space that was rightfully ours, the more the myth of the monstrous began to evaporate. We were not changing the laws of the empire overnight, nor were we dismantling the structures of the workhouses immediately. But we were doing something perhaps more profound. We were changing the culture. We were making it impossible for the average Londoner to sustain the lie that anyone among us was fundamentally other. Every time we refused to reduce to our conditions, we invited the city to grow up, to look closer, and to finally see the people standing right in front of them. The Burgundy Hall was a ghost, a remnant of a darker age, while out here beneath the soft glow of the gaslights. On a busy Tuesday evening, the world felt a little bit wider, a little bit more open, and remarkably more human. Inside the Metropolitan Exhibition Hall, time had a sickly, stagnant quality. It was a loop, the same questions from the audience, the same rehearsed answers, the same gaslight flickering at the same hour every night. We were trapped in a permanent present, a display case where change was forbidden because change would mean the loss of the wonder we were meant to provide. But out here, in the breathing, sweating city, time moved in a linear, relentless, and beautiful direction. Seasons turned not just on the calendar, but in the grime on the window panes, the fashion on the streets, and the news in the papers. We were aging, we were learning, and we were evolving. It is a profound thing to realize that you are no longer a relic. In the hall, I was a curiosity to be dated, measured, and stored in the memory of the observer as a static point in time. But here I was a participant in the unfolding history of the Victorian age. I was watching the skyline change as buildings were pulled down to make way for new rail lines. I was hearing the debate about electricity replacing gas. I was witnessing the slow, agonizing, but undeniable progress of rights and representation. We realized our survival was, in itself, a critique of the era. The site thrived on keeping us stationary was being left behind by the very progress it boasted of. Every new innovation, every new medical library, every new civic institution was a step away from the dark voyeuristic impulse that had powered the freak shows. We were no longer subjects of the past, we were agents of the future. The connections we made, the jobs we held, the books we read, all of it contributed to a quiet collective momentum. We had escaped the time of the freak show, where the afflicted were destined to remain forever trapped in their misery, and entered the time of the real, where struggle leads to change and where the human capacity for growth is the only true constant. We weren't just living through the end of an era, we were helping to define the beginning of a more enlightened one. The shadow of the hall still lingered. It always would, like a scar that fades but never fully disappears, but it no longer held any power over our days. We had broken the clock, and for the first time we were free to see where the hours would take us. Years have passed since we walked out of that burgundy, painted hall. The building itself is gone now, replaced by the relentless expansion of a new London, a city of steel, electric lights, and bustling commerce. The era of the freak show as a mainstream pastime has, for the most part, crumbled into the dusty footnotes of history. A relic of a time when society sought to define its own health by showcasing the sickness of others. We often talk about the scars we carried. In the hall, those scars were our currency. They were the reason people paid their sixpences. But out here, in the life we built for ourselves, those same scars became the markers of our survival. They are the physical record of a system that tried to own us and failed. When historians look back at this period, they often focus on the grand reforms, the parliamentary debates, and the technological leaps. But there is another history, the history of the people who were supposed to be invisible. Our lives, our quiet jobs, our friendships, and our small daily acts of dignity were the true levers that moved the world forward. We were the ones who proved that the standard human was a myth. We demonstrate that a body with a curvature, a limb of different proportions, or a face with a history etched into its lines was not a specimen of curiosity, but a vessel for a life as profound and complex as any other. The image of the Victorian era is often captured in stiff, formal portraits or dramatic scenes of industry. But the true story lies in the change of perspective. The moment the observer realized the person they were looking at was, in fact, looking back at them with equal humanity. That shift in the gaze was the most revolutionary act of the century. We have reached a point where the anger has softened into memory, and the fear has been replaced by a quiet, settled strength. We were not the heroes of a grand war, nor were we the villains of a moral play. We were simply the people who decided that our humanity was not a commodity to be auctioned off. As I sit now watching the sun dip below the rooftops of London, I see a city that is not perfect, but it is one that has grown. It is a city that has learned, if only slowly, that every individual carries a story that belongs to them alone. The Burgundy Hall is a ghost, but we are the living, breathing evidence that the spirit is far more resilient than the structures built to contain it. We have written our own ending, not in ink on paper, but in the lives we chose to lead every single day with our heads held high. History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges. It prefers grand dates, treaties, and the names of the powerful. It is often too tired or too busy to notice the people who lived in the margins, the ones who spent their nights by dying fires in drafty halls, or the ones who walk through the London fog with the weight of being a spectacle on their shoulders. But those rough edges are where the true pulse, quickening heart of history resides. As we age, and the memories of the Burgundy walls begin to blur like a watercolour left too long in the rain, we realise that our most important task was never just to survive, it was to document. We were the custodians of a perspective that the official record had deemed unworthy of ink. Eliza's scraps of paper, the letters we exchanged, the hidden journals we kept, these are our true legacy. They are not merely records of pain. They are records of thought, of ambition, and of the unyielding refusal to be a footnote in someone else's success story. We have become the keepers of a history that refuses to stay silent. We often imagine the future looking back at us. We wonder if, 100 years from now, someone will find these fragments and understand that we were not just anomalies, we were teachers. We were the ones who held up a mirror to a society that didn't want to see its own reflection, and by forcing that confrontation, we helped it become something slightly better. The world is constantly categorizing people, building new halls, creating new stages, and finding new curiosities to stare at. That impulse is deep-seated in the human condition. But the antidote to that impulse is the same today as it was in 1878, the act of telling one's own story. When you seize the pen, when you own your narrative, you take the power away from the ones who want to define you. We are the ghosts of the Burgundy Hall, yes, but we are also the architects of the freedom that followed. Every time a person stands up, every time they refuse to be diminished, every time they claim their right to exist in the world on their own terms, they are walking in the footsteps of the rebellion we started. Our story is not a tragedy, it is a testament. It is proof that even in the coldest, darkest London winter, the human spirit is a fire that cannot be extinguished. London in the late 1870s was a city that felt like it was hold its breath. The smoke from the factories hung heavy, a soot, stained canopy over the lives of millions, but beneath that smog something else was stirring. We were not the only ones who felt the walls closing in. All across the city, the foundations of the Victorian social order were beginning to show their structural failures. We began to hear talk of social citizenship. It was a radical concept that every individual, regardless of their station in life, their physical health, or their economic utility, possessed inherent rights. This was a direct assault on the charity culture that had once treated us like property. I remember listening to a street orator near Smithfield Market, a man shouting about the dignity of the labourer, the right to education, and the necessity of dismantling the workhouses. His words resonated with us in a way they never would have back in the hall. When you are on display, you are effectively a non-person, a static image meant for the comfort of others. When you are on the street, you are a participant in a grand, chaotic, and often cruel, yet exhilarating experiment. We realized that our presence in the public sphere was a form of political agitation. By merely walking, working, and existing without the label of afflicted, we were actively disrupt the narrative that the powerful had constructed for their own convenience. The history books often speak of the Victorian era as a time of rigid moral codes and unwavering tradition. They forget that it was also a time of intense struggle, a period where people from the lowest rungs of society began to demand that their humanity be recognized. We were part of that struggle. We were the silent evidence that the system was wrong. As the months turned into years, the urgency of our personal rebellion faded in the background, replaced by a deep, abiding satisfaction. We were no longer fighting to prove we were human. We were simply living as if it had never been in question. The Burgundy Hall had been a dark, narrow tunnel, but the city we stepped into was a vast, sprawling landscape of possibility. We had become part of the very fabric of London, a city that was slowly, painfully, but surely learning that its greatness was not defined by how it treated its wonders, but by how it treated its most vulnerable. There was a profound change in the air of London as the decade drew to a close. The flickering yellow gaslight that had defined our evenings in the hall was being replaced by the steady, harsh, and uncompromising hum of electricity. It was as if the city itself was deciding that it had spent enough time in the shadows. This technological shift wasn't just about brightness, it was about visibility. In the dim gas-lit halls of the exhibition circuit, A clever manager could hide the truth behind drapery, shadow and stagecraft, but in the era of the electric bulb, there was nowhere to hide. The new light was democratic. It revealed the grime on the wall, the truth of a person's face, and the reality of a body, without the flattering, deceitful manipulation of the old shadows. We watched this transformation with a mix of trepidation and hope. For us, the freak show industry had always relied on the alchemy of the dim, mysterious room. If you brought a curiosity into the harsh, clear light of day, the magic of the monster evaporated, leaving only a fellow human being. The electrification of London was, in a sense, the ultimate enemy of the exhibit hall. We began to notice that the crowds themselves were changing. They were becoming less interested in the mysteries of the past, and more obsessed with the mechanics of the future. The conversation on the street moved from the miracles of the showmen to the engineering of the new bridges, the layout of the underground railways, and the promise of a more connected, efficient, and most importantly, public society. The others were becoming more integrated, not because the city suddenly came kinder, but because it became too efficient to waste time on such theatrical cruelty. The gears of industrial progress were grind away at the old, superstitious hierarchies. We weren't just witnessing the march of science. We were witnessing the march of a society that was finally beginning to value the functioning person over the staged curiosity. We saw these changes as a vindication. Our presence in the city was becoming less of a jarring note and more of an accepted, if still misunderstood, part of the urban landscape. We were the evidence that the world was move on. We were the legacy of a time when society was still learn how to see. And as the lights of London grew brighter, we felt ourselves becoming lighter, less defined by the shadows of our past, and more defined by the reality of our present. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes with being ignored in a city of millions. For years in the Burgundy, walled hall, our existence was predicated on being seen. Every movement was calculated to draw a gaze. Every deformity was a prompt for a reaction. We lived in a state of hyper-visibility, where our identities were suffocated by the projections of the audience. But as the 8880s began to take hold, we found solace in the anonymity of the London crowds. To walk down Fleet Street in the pouring rain, collar turned up against the chill, was a revolutionary act. To be jostled by a businessman who didn't look twice, to be just another face in the blur of the passing omnibus. To have no one wonder what your story was, this was the truest form of liberation we had ever known. We learned that the opposite of spectacle is not fame, but privacy. The Victorian society, with its obsession for classification, the criminal classes, the labouring poor, the deserving versus the undeserving, had a space for everyone, provided you stayed in your designated category. By simply moving through the city, working different jobs, and existing in public spaces, with announcing our histories, we were subverting the entire social order. We were like water flowing through the cracks of the rigid Victorian grid, impossible to contain or label. You watch William one afternoon as he sat on a park bench in Hyde Park reading a newspaper. He was a giant of a man, his frame imposing, yet he was entirely unbothered. A child walked by, glanced at him, and looked away to chase a hoop. A governess passed, lost in thought. He was just a man sitting on a bench. For a moment I saw the true weight of what we had achieved. We had reclaimed our right to a mundane life. We weren't just escaping the hall, we were escaping the category. We were proving that human existence is not meant to be a static display in a curated room. It is a fluid, changing and private affair. As the fog rolled in from the Thames that evening, obscuring the gaslights and turning the city into a soft grey canvas, I realised that we were no longer defined by our history. We were defined by our potential to spend the next hour and the next year exactly as we chose. The city was large, cold, and oft indifferent, but it was finally, mercifully, ours. By the late 8880s, the freak show industry was beginning to feel like a relic of a primitive past, even to those who once patronised it. The change was driven by the rise of the public education acts and the growing accessibility of knowledge. As the working class began to read, discuss, engage with the political realities of the British Empire, the appetite for the exotic and the monstrous lost its flavour. It was replaced by a burgeoning interest in human rights and social justice. When a society begins to educate its citizens, it implicitly asks them to engage with the world in more complex ways. The simple binary view, us versus them, normal versus freak, could not survive the intellectual expansion of the era. The very act of reading a newspaper, of understanding the plight of workers in the industrial north, or of debating the colonial policies abroad, forced the Victorian citizen to grapple with the humanity of the other. We were the living evidence of this shift. We were no longer characters in their entertainment. We were peers in their public sphere. The barriers that once kept us in the hall were not just physical. They were intellectual walls built on the foundation of ignorance. Once those walls were challenged by education, the burgundy, walled rooms could no longer contain us. I remember watching a crowd outside a new community centre. They weren't there to see a spectacle. They were there to listen to a lecture on sanitation, on history, on the rights of the common man. The energy was different. It was purposeful. It lacked the jagged, nervous edge of the exhibition hall crowds. It was a crowd that was learned to see them not as spectators of the human condition, but as participants in it. The decline of the exhibit hall was inevitable. It was a market that relied on a lack of understanding, and the world was finally, albeit slowly, beginning to understand. We, who had once been the primary source of that misunderstanding, were now the architects of a new way of being. We had moved from being the observed to being the observers, watching the era of the spectacle crumble under the weight of its own obsolescence. The burgundy walls were now just memories, and the stage was gone, replaced by the open, demanding, and increasingly human streets of London. The turn of the century brought with it a different kind of fog, not the thick, coal-choked soup of the Victorian winters, but a haze of uncertainty that came with the dawn of a new industrialised age. The burgundy walls of our old prison are now like painted over, turned in shops, or perhaps demolished to make room for the new tram lines that criss-crossed the city like veins of steel. We are old now. Our bodies, once the focus of such cruel curiosity, have surrendered to the slow, natural passage of time. But there is a peace in this, a peace that the managers of the exhibition halls could never have understood. We are no longer defined by how we look or how we perform. We are defined by the lives we have pieced together, the friendships we have forged in the quiet corners of this city, and the silence we kept when we finally broke free. I often think about the people who used to walk those doors. Where are they now? Have they forgotten the thrill they felt when they looked at us? Probably. And that is the ultimate victory. The fact that we have become forgettable, the fact that we have blended in the background of a nation that is racing toward modernity, is the greatest proof of our success. To be unremarkable is a privilege we once fought for with our very lives. We did not change the world overnight. We did not tear down the empire. We simply refused to be the mirror for their shadows. By existing as people flawed, ordinary, complex people, we forced the society around us to grow up. We forced them to look away from the spectacle and toward the human. The struggle wasn't a grand, sweeping epic. It was the accumulation of 1,000 quiet mornings, 1,000 voided gazes, and 1,000 moments where we chose our own dignity over their pity. The history books will likely never record our names. They will talk about the monarchs, the inventors, and the generals. But in the quiet, dusty streets of London, in the small, resilient hearts of those who continue to claim their place in this world, our story persists. It is the story of the day the curtain fell and the stage was finally left empty. As we look toward the horizon of the 9900s, the Victorian era feels like a fever dream that is finally breaking. The frantic, nervous energy of the century, the obsession with measurement, the desire to categorize, and the peculiar, dark hunger to display what was different is being replaced by something else, the cold, efficient, and chaotic rush of modernity. We are leaving behind a world that needed exhibits to confirm its own sense of normalcy. We are moving into a world that is too fast, too loud, and too distracted to care about such things. And in this indifference, we have found our ultimate sanctuary. People often ask what we want to leave behind. Do we want our story told in the grand halls of academia? Do we want a plaque on the wall where the hall once stood? No, our legacy is not in the history books that raritize the victors and the monarchs. Our legacy is in the simple, mundane right to live without being explained. We leave behind a world where the spectacle has lost its power. We leave behind a generation that is learning that the true depth of a human being cannot be captured in a side-saw booth, nor can it be defined by a medical diagram. We have taught the city, through our refuse to stay in our assigned roles, that every life is an internal architecture, a complex, private structure that no outside has the right to dismantle or inspect for their own amusement. The fog that once shrouded the secrets of the exhibition halls is lifting. In its place is the sharp, electric clarity of a new century. It is not a perfect world. There will be wars, there will be new forms of exploitation, and the struggle for dignity will always be a work in progress. But the fundamental lie, that one human being is a curiosity and another is normal, is beginning to sound like a dusty, archaic whisper from a world that we have outlived. We have finished our time in the spotlight, and we have lived long enough to see the curtains come down for good. We are not the curiosities of the Victorian era. We are the precursors a century that must learn to value the individual, not for their wonder, but for their existence. We walked out of the hall as prisoners, but we are entering the new century as something far more dangerous to the old order. We are simply ourselves. If you were to walk down the street where the Metropolitan Exhibition Hall once stood, you would find nothing but the ordinary hum of a city that has forgotten it ever existed. The velvet curtains have long since rotted away, the gaslights have been torn down, and the silence that now occupies. That space is not the oppressive, heavy silence of our imprisonment, but the clean, empty silence of a slate wiped clear. We have spent our final years witnessing this erosion of the spectacle. We watched as the next generation grew up in a world where the idea of paying to stare at another human being became, slowly but surely, something to be ashamed of rather than something to be celebrated. This was our quiet victory. We didn't need statues or books to mark our passage. The simple fact that the practice died out is the only monument we ever required. Hands that once performed 1,000 small, obedient gestures to satisfy a crowd. I see the hands of an old person, no more, no less. There is no curiosity here. There is only the history of a life lived. We have learned that the most radical thing one can do in a society obsessed with labels is to refuse to be defined by them. To be simply a person is in its own way a profound act of defiance. The Victorian era was a time of immense pressure to be perfect, to be productive, to be normal. It built walls to keep those pressures in place. But all walls eventually succumbed to the slow, persistent work of time. The Burgundy Hall was just one of many, and it fell just like the empires and the ideologies that supported it. We are not sad to see it go. We are not sad to be forgotten. To be forgotten is to be free. It means the narrative that was forced upon us has lost its grip. It means we are no longer the monsters or the victims. We are just the people who walked out the door and never looked back. As the last echoes of the Victorian age fade in the distance, we sit in the quiet, grateful for the simple, unscripted grace of a world that no longer asks us to perform. The stage is empty, the house lights are dimmed, and for the first time the story is entirely our own. As we stand at the threshold of a new era, the world looks back at the Victorian age not with the narrow-minded fascination of our former captors, but with the critical eye of an age that claims to know better. We, who once walked the tightrope between being human and exhibit, have become the silent, invisible witnesses to this transition. We understood that progress is not measured solely by the steam engine, the telegraph, or the electric light. True progress is measured by the retraction of the boundaries of the other. It is the slow, arduous process of expanding the deaf and account as a neighbour, a citizen, and a human being. We were the anomaly that forced that expansion. The history we leave behind is written in the margins of the newspapers, in the quiet letters exchanged between people who were deemed different, and in the shifting laws that slowly began to grant us the right to exist in the public space without being categorized. We were the grit that slowed the gears of a machine designed to dehumanize. The velvet curtains have turned to dust. The gaslight is a flicker in a forgotten ledger. But the questions we raised remain. Who has the right to look at another person? By what authority do we classify the existence of our peers? And when does a society become truly civilized? We are no longer waiting for the curtain to rise. We are living in the sunlight of a world that, for all its faults, has at least learned to look away from the sides how and look toward the person. Our story, once contained within the walls of a room that sought to profit from our pain, has now spilled out into the vast, open geography of the human experience. It is a story of survival, yes, but more importantly, it is a story of realization. We realized that we were never the curiosities they claimed us to be. We were the people who, by simply existing, were holding a mirror up to a world that was only just beginning to learn how to truly see itself. There is no longer a we in the sense of a group defined by a common struggle. There is only the I and the millions of other I's that make up the pulsing, chaotic and ever-evolving city of London as we move into the 1900s. The urgency that once drove our every action, the need to prove our humanity to those who saw us as curiosities, has evaporated, replaced by the quiet, steady rhythm of daily life. We have learned that the greatest victory is not to be remembered for our differences, but to be ignored for our ordinariness. When you walk through the crowded markets of East End or stand on the bustling platforms of the new underground stations, you realize that the city has no memory of the monsters it once patronized. It has moved on, occupied with its own growth, its own failures, and its own future. The barriers we once fought so hard to dismantle have been replaced by the invisible, yet impenetrable, walls of modern social etiquette. But these walls are not for us alone, they are for everyone. We are no longer the exception to the rule. We are simply part of the rule. We have gained the right to be unnoticed, the right to have a bad day without it being a character flaw, and the right to grow old without being observed as a specimen of decay. This is the ultimate evolution of our story. We did not set out to change the world's heart, for that is a task for the gods. We set out to change our own place within it, and in doing so we forced the world to adjust its focus. The Burgundy Hall was a place where light was manipulated to create a lie. The world we live in now, however messy and imperfect, is at least one where the light is increasingly, if reluctantly, truthful. We have reached the end of the script that was written for us. The pages are blank now, waiting for the ink of our own choices. As we sit in the quiet of a room that no longer needs to be a stage, we realize that the most beautiful thing about the end of this journey is that there is no more audience. There is only us, and the time we have left to live simply as we are. As the calendar turns toward the dawn of the new century, we find us reflecting on the nature of legacy. For a long time we feared that if we disappeared, our story would be lost with us. We feared that the world would revert to its old voyeuristic ways, finding new wonders to cage and display. But as we look at the streets of London, filled with the noise of electric trams and the rushing feet of a generation that has never seen the inside of a Burgundy Hall, we realize that we were never fighting to be remembered as individuals. We were fighting to make the institution of the spectacle obsolete. This is the nature of true social progress. It becomes so integrated into the fabric of daily life that it eventually feels like it was always the case. The idea that a person is a sovereign individual, not a curiosity to be appraised, has slowly seeped into the collective consciousness of this city. It is not a victory declared by a general or a law passed by a parliament. It is a shift in the very soul of the public. We see this in the way children now look at difference. There is a lack of the predatory, nervous curiosity that once defined the Victorian audience. There is a dawning recognition, a flicker of empathy, that suggests the world has finally begun to understand that. Every body holds a world within it, a world that is not for sale, not for display, and certainly not for ridicule. Our final duty, therefore, is not to write our own biographies, but to let our memories dissolve into the city. We are the shadows that made the light appear brighter. We are the silence that allowed a new, more empathetic voice to be heard. As we sit here, observing the final sunset of this century, we feel no bitterness. We have seen the end of the show. We have walked out of the hall, and for the first time, we aren't looking back to see if someone is watching. We are finally unequivocally just ourselves. The year is drawing to a close, and with it, the long, oppressive twilight of the Victorian era. It is not merely the calendar that feels like it is turning. It is the entire moral and social bedrock of the nation. As we walk through the fog-laden streets of London, the air feels thinner, sharper, charged with the static of coming change. We are no longer just people moving through a city. We are witnesses to the decay of an empire's confidence. We remember, with a mixture of irony and bitter clarity, how the halls of our confinement were built on the premise that humanity could be neatly organized, labeled, and placed behind glass. The men who managed those spaces, the showmen, the collectors, the self-proclaimed men of science, were not acting alone. They were the shock troops of entire culture that derived its sense of superiority by cataloguing the monstrous. They believed that if they could define the outer limits of the human form, they could secure the centre of their own civilization. But the architecture of this belief is crumbling. We see it in the pamphlets sold at the street corners, no longer just fables or reports of curiosities. but tracts written by social reformers, labour agitators, and advocates for the rights of the underprivileged. These texts are often rough, printed on cheap paper, smell of ink and despair, but they carry a weight that no exhibition ever could. They speak of the conditions in the factories, the despair in the workhouses, and the hypocrisy of a morality that drapes itself in velvet while trampling on the dignity of the living. We have spent many evenings in the dimly lit reading rooms, listening to men and women debate the merits of a new, more inclusive social contract. It is a slow, agonizing process. You can see the resistance in the eyes of the establishment, the fear that once the different are no longer labelled, the whole system of privilege will collapse. This is the irony we carry in our pockets like a secret. The very system that created us, the system that needed us to be freaks to feel normal, is currently tearing itself apart to maintain its own fading relevance. Every time we walk past the site where the exhibition hall once stood, occupied by a warehouse of mundane dry goods, we feel a profound sense of vindication. We don't need a monument to know we won. The victory is not that we are being praised, it is that we are being ignored. The city has stopped looking for the wonder in our bodies and has started looking for the humanity in our actions. This, we realize, is the most profound shift of all. We are no longer the focal point of their anxiety. We have been absorbed, slowly and painfully, into the fabric of the ordinary. And in that ordinary, we have finally found the space to breathe, to think, and to become, for the first time, truly and unequivocally ourselves. As we moved deeper in the 8890s, we noticed a subtle yet seismic shift in the culture around us, a change that was reflected not in the grand halls of power, but in the shop windows, the penny dreadfuls, and the shifting social etiquette of the London streets. The era of the spectacle was not just dying, it was being actively dismantled by a new form of storytelling, one that traded in empathy rather than alienation. For decades we had been the subjects of the gaze, a cold, analytical and possessive look that stripped away our individuality to highlight our otherness. We were reduced to a series of physical measurements, the height of a stature, the curve of a bone, the specific pigmentation of skin. But as the decade waned, we started to encounter stories in novels, in the increasingly popular photographic journals, and even in the hushed conversations in coffee houses that treated these very same differences with a profound humanizing depth. People were beginning to realize that the freak was a construct of the imagination, a shadow projected by the viewer's own insecurities. The new generation of writers and thinkers, those who had been influenced by the radical shift towards social consciousness, started to write characters, who were not defined by their outward appearance, but by their internal struggles, their loves, their losses, and their capacity for resilience. We watched with a quiet, observant pride as the society that had once paid to stare at us began to pay to understand us. This was a profound psychological evolution. It meant that the barrier between the normal and the abnormal was becoming porous. When a reader sees their own pain mirrored in the struggle of someone who looks entirely different from them, the entire machinery of the sides begins to rust. The us and them dynamic, which had been the bedrock of Victorian social control, started to fracture. We were no longer characters in a grotesque play. We were, in the eyes of an increasingly observant public, participants in the messy, unscripted drama of human existence. This wasn't a sudden, revolutionary enlightenment. It was a grueling, slow-moving shift in the collective conscience. Every day we would see someone in the street look at us, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, the look would change. It would no longer be the predatory stare of the hall. It would be the neutral, acknowledging gaze of one human recognizing another. In that look we found our final, total emancipation. The halls were closing, the curtains were being pulled down, and the lights were being extinguished on performance of our suffering. We were finally becoming just people, walking on the same pavements, breathing the same soot-heavy air, and living the same fragile lives as the people who had once thought they were our masters. The transition was complete. We were no longer the show, we were the audience. We were, finally, observers of a world that was learning painfully, slowly, to stop looking at the mask and start seeing the person behind it. As the 8890s drew to a close, the shift in London's culture atmosphere was mirrored by a fundamental change in its economic reality. The exhibition halls, which had once been lucrative enterprises, were slowly suffocating under the weight of an evolving market. In the mid-Victorian era, the freak show had been a reliable commodity, a low-cost, high-yield business that thrived on the lack of affordable entertainment for the working class. But as the Industrial Revolution matured, so did the options available to the public. The rise of mass-produced newspapers, the expansion of municipal libraries, and the birth of early cinema were providing the public with something the exhibition halls could not: engagement with the wider world. The economy of curiosity was being replaced by the economy of information. People no longer needed to pay 6p to see a wonder from across the globe when they could read about, and soon see moving pictures of distant lands and exotic developments for a fraction of the cost. Furthermore, the labour movement was beginning to demand a different kind of dignity. As trade unions gained power, they fought against the dehumanization of the workforce, a struggle that implicitly encompassed everyone whose body was treated as a tool or a commodity. When the standard for labour became rights and representation, rather than submission and endurance, the entire concept of the exhibit became morally and economically untenable. We watched with a sense of grim satisfaction as the managers' men who had once viewed us as capital found their ventures failing. They tried to spice up their displays with more sensationalist claims, louder barkers, and more elaborate deceptions, but the public had grown weary. The society that was fueling the massive expansion of the British railway system, the electrification of the streets, and the growth of civic infrastructure simply didn't have the time or the appetite for such archaic distractions anymore. We saw this as the inevitable triumph of complexity over simplicity. The system that relied on the monster was being outpaced by the system that required the citizen. We, who had been on the receiving end of this industry's cruelty, were witnessing its death throes. Every empty seat in a theatre, every boarded-up hall, every showman who had to find honest work, each was a brick falling from the wall that had once separated us from the rest of the world. We were not merely surviving, we were watching the old world collapse, reckoning that its fall was the necessary precursor to a life where we, and others like us, would finally be allowed to exist without the constant pressure of being scrutinized. The market for our misery had finally crashed, and in its ruins we found the liberty to simply be ourselves. As we moved into the final years of the century, we witnessed an extraordinary transformation in the topography of London. It wasn't just the architecture that was changing, with the imposing soot-darkened facades of the mid-Victorian era being punctuated by the cleaner, more functional lines of the new century, but the very flow of human movement. The expansion of the Underground Railway and the proliferation of the electric tram system turned the city into a hyper-connect entity, a living, breathing mechanism where millions moved in a constant, churning cycle. Before this era of connectivity, London had been a city of enclaves, isolated neighbourhoods where the peculiar could be hidden in plain sight, protected by the density of the slums or the exclusivity of the private exhibition halls. A freak show required a degree of segregation. It relied on the fact that normal society could go about its business without ever having to brush shoulders with those they deemed curiosities. But as the city expanded, as the trams cut through the old neighbourhoods and the underground lines bridged the gaps between the wealthy West and the struggling East, that segregation became impossible to maintain. The freak show was fundamentally an island in the middle of a sea. When that sea became a storm of movement, commuting and public interaction, the island was submerged. We, who had once been the inhabitants of those islands, found ourselves suddenly adrift in the currents of the general public. We were no longer hidden away. We were forced in the light of the omnibus, the queue at the railway station, and the crowds at the public parks. This was initially terrifying. We had built our survival on the strategy of being specialized curiosities. To be suddenly thrust into the anonymity of the crowd felt like a loss of identity. But we quickly realized that this was the truest form of protection. In a city where everyone is rushing, everyone is a stranger, and everyone is focused on their own struggle for survival, no one has the time to pause and stare. The indifference of the crowd, the very thing we once feared, became our greatest armour. We learned that to be invisible in a crowd is the ultimate form of power. We were no longer characters in the show. We were extras in the grand, chaotic and beautiful play of the city itself. The walls of the Burgundy Hall had been designed to focus attention. The streets of the modern city were designed to diffuse it. By simply existing, by taking the train to work, by buying a loaf of bread, by standing in the rain waiting for the tram, we were actively participating in the dismantling of the old, restricting social hierarchies. The Victorian need to classify was being outrun by the modern need to function, and in that race we finally found our place. As we crossed the final threshold of the century, the most profound shift occurred not in the streets or the halls of government, but in the domestic sphere. The Victorian ideology had been built on a rigid model of paternalism, the idea that those deemed different or weak were subjects to be cared for, controlled, and protected by the benevolent authority of the state or the church. This was, in essence, an extension of the exhibition hall's logic. If you are not normal, you are a ward, not an equal. But as the 1900s approached, a new philosophy of autonomy began to emerge. It was a messy, often contradictory movement, pushed forward by those who had lived in the shadows and were tired of being told what was best for them. We saw this in the way the local boarding houses began to treat their tenants. We saw it in the small, defiant acts of individuals who rejected charity in favour of labour. For us, this was the ultimate test. It meant moving away from the safety of communal, supervised living, where we were protected but inherently diminished in the unpredictable, often lonely, but infinitely more rewarding reality of personal independence. We had to learn the bureaucratic language of the modern city, how to sign a lease, how to negotiate a wage, how to navigate the complex social codes of a neighbourhood that didn't know our history. This was not easy. The shadow of the showman still loomed, and for many we were still objects of curiosity. But the difference was that we now had the legal and social tools to say no. We could decline an invitation to perform. We could walk away from a landlord who treated our presence as a novelty. We could build our own social circles based on mutual respect rather than the voyeurism of the past. The shift towards autonomy was the final nail in the coffin of the sides how. A society that recognized the individual's right to self-determination cannot, by definition, treat that same individual as a spectacle. Every time we successfully negotiate a lease, every time we stood our ground in a public argument, every time we simply acted with the same expectations of privacy and respect as our neighbours, we were effectively rewriting the social contract. We were no longer subjects of a paternalistic system, we were agents of our own survival. And as we watched the sun set on the Victorian era, we realised that the independence we had fought for was not just a personal victory, it was a structural change in the definition of a human being. The freak had been a product of an era that wanted to control everything. The individual was the product of an era that was frighteningly, wonderfully starting to let go. The era of being managed was over. The era of being lived had begun. For much of the Victorian era, the medical profession shared an uneasy, and often parasitic, relationship with the exhibition halls. Physicians and men of science would frequently visit the Burgundy, walled rooms, not to heal, but to categorize. They treat our bodies as specimens, measuring the length of limbs or the irregularity of features with a detached clinic cruelty that felt no different from the gawking of the paying public. It was a science of cataloguing difference, intended to reinforce the hierarchies of what they deemed normal and pathological. But as the 8890s progressed, a revolutionary change occurred in the medical world. It was the rise of what we now understand as modern clinical medicine, a field that began to prioritize the patient's health over the observer's curiosity. We watched as the demonstrator of human oddities began to lose his status. The professional physician, once eager to present us in front of a lecture hall as a lecture on degeneration, started to shift his focus toward the actual treatment of human suffering. The influence of Lister's antiseptic techniques, the birth of modern surgery, and the growing understanding of genetics, though still in its infancy, meant that the anomalous body was no longer a puzzle to be stared at, but a condition to be understood and treated. This shift was a profound blow to the freak show industry. When medicine stops viewing a person as a curiosity and starts viewing them as a patient, the market for spectacle collapses. No longer could a manager advertise a body as a divine mystery or a biologically disaster. The public was increasingly being educated to see the medical reality behind it. We recall a particular visit to a medic clinic near the end of the century. The doctor didn't reach for a measuring tape or summon his students to take notes on our abnormalities. He asked us, simply and directly, about our pain, our daily struggles, and how he could assist us in living a more comfortable life. In that singular act, the centuries, old weight of being a specimen was lifted from our shoulders. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible revolution. The halls of science were closing their doors to the circus. The age of the medal peep show was ending, and in its place was a more sober, more humane, and infinitely more respectful approach to human diversity. We realized then that our physical existence was not a failure of nature to be displayed, but a variation to be understood. By aligning with the progress of true medicine, we were finally able to reclaim our own bodies, no longer as public property, but as private, living and sovereign entities. The era of the specimen was dead. The era of the person had finally arrived. The turn of the century did not arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet hum of a city that had finally learned how to be itself. We watched as the last of the exhibition halls, those dark burgundy, stained mausoleums of human curiosity, were cleared out. The velvet was stripped, the posters scraped from the walls, and the spaces reclaimed by the utilitarian needs of a new era. What was once a place for the dark gratification of voyeurs was now a warehouse, a print shop, or a tenement block. The erasure was total, and it was glorious. As we walked through the newly paved streets, we felt the heavy, suffocating weight of being observed lift from our shoulders. In the Victorian logic, a body was a fixed point, a status to be held. In the new century, we discovered that a person is a process. We were no longer bound by the rigid categories that society had once used to define us. We had become, in the most profound way possible, our own architects. We took jobs, and we engaged in the small, unremarkable acts of civic life, paying taxes, voting, participating in community debates that define the dignity of an individual. There was a unique kind of power in being unremarkable. For years we had been the centre of attention. Now we were simply a part of the background. We had traded the spotlight of the freak show for the radiant, anonymous freedom of the public square. This was the culmination of everything we had fought for. We had not overturned the monarchy or rewritten the Constitution, but we had done something far more radical. We had successfully defended our right to be ordinary. We had reclaimed the mundane. We had insisted that our lives were not to be interpreted through the lens of a spectator, but through the lived experience of our own choices. The scars remained, of course. The emotional remnants of a life lived behind glass are not so easily erased, but they no longer defined our horizon. They were merely the history we carried, the maps of a country we had crossed and survived. As we stood on the banks of the Thames, watching the new electric, lit ships navigate the river, we realized that we were no longer the afflicted. We were, at long last, just people. We were the silent evidence that human resilience is the only force capable of tearing down the institutions of prejudice. The curtain had closed, and the world, vast, cold, and wonderfully indifferent, was finally open to us in all its complexity. As we stand on the threshold of the new century, we realize that history is a select filter. It keeps the kings, the inventors, and the conquerors, while allowing the lived realities of the exhibited, those who stood in the crosshairs of society's morbid curiosity, to slip through the cracks. But there is a profound justice in this erasure. To be forgotten is to be freed from the labels that once chained us. The silence that now surrounds our past is not a void. It is the peaceful resting place of a trauma that no longer has power. In these final moments, we reflect on what it meant to be the other in a world that thrived on categorizing its citizens. We were the living metaphors of a society's insecurities. Every time the public looked at us, they were not seeing our humanity. They were looking for confirmation of their own normality. But our defiance was not found in grand speeches or public protests. It was found in the mundane, the act of reading a book, the refusal to perform on command, the quiet endurance of a gaze we could not return. We have watched as the physical structures that defined our lives, those burgundy, walled halls, the dimly lit stages, the velvet-roped enclosures, have been replaced by the infrastructure of a modern, bustling city. The telegraph lines and the steam-powered machines have paved over the sites of our suffering, and in this process the spectacle has been stripped of its sting. We realize now that our true triumph lies in the fact that our descendants will never know a world where such exhibitions were considered entertainment. The moral gravity of the world has shifted. It has moved from the voyeuristic appraisal of the body to an implicit acknowledgement of the sanctity of the individual. We did not change this world by force. We changed it by existing. We forced society to confront its own cruelty until that cruelty became too heavy, too archaic, and eventually too shameful to maintain. As the sun sets on the final day of this era, We feel a sense of profound completeness. We are no longer the monsters of the whole, nor are we the victims of the state. We are simply and finally human. The stage has been dismantled, the lights have been extinguished, and the audience has long since gone home. We are left with the silence of a new age, a silence that we have earned through a lifetime of quiet, persistent rebellion. The story is no longer being written for us. It is at last ours to live in the quiet anonymity of a world that has finally learned how to look away. As the new century settles in, we find that the most potent weapon we ever possessed was not our resilience nor our anger, but our ability to eventually become invisible. In the Victorian era, we were hypervisible. Our bodies were maps of curiosity that every passerby felt entitled to interpret. We were fixed, static, and perpetually exposed. But today, walking through the bustling, foggy arteries of London, we realise that the city has granted us the one thing we never had, the right to be ignored. To be invisible in a city of millions is a privilege. It means that you can move through a crowded street without being a point of interest. It means your history, your trauma, and your physic form are not public property. We have spent years unlearning the performative habits of the exhibition hall, the way we used to carry our bodies to satisfy an audience, the way we used to anticipate the questions of strangers. We are learning the posture of the ordinary. This invisibility is not a loss of self. It is the ultimate reclamation of self. When no one is watching, you are free to define your own identity. You are no longer the wondrous anomaly or the scientific curiosity. You are just a person who is tired or hopeful or in a hurry or lost in thought. You are a person with a private life, an internal world that remains uninvaded by the public eye. The Victorian social order was a theatre where everyone had a role to play. The elite were the patrons, the workers were the props, and the different were the entertainment. By refusing to play our part, by walking away from the stage, we force the tier to close. The people around us, the clerks, the flower sellers, the businessmen, are no longer looking for a show. They are too busy with their own lives, their own failures, and their own small human joys. We are, for the first time, equal to everyone else in our anonymity. We are just one face among millions, and in that crowd we find a profound, quiet peace. The walls of the old hall are gone, not just because they were torn down, but because the gaze that sustained them has finally shifted. We have taught the city that we are not the subjects of its curiosity. We are the observers of its evolution. As we do so not as exhibits, but as neighbours, unseen, unremarked, and finally completely free. If you look closely at the hands of someone who has lived through the transition of 2 centuries, you will see more than just the marks of aging. You will see a map. For those of us who were once objects in the Burgundy Hall, our bodies were treated as public records, things to be studied, measured, and mocked. But time in its infinite mercy has a way of softening those sharp edges. The scars that once pointed at by the curious are now simply part of the geography of our own skin, no longer carrying the weight of being a spectacle. There is a profound, quiet strength in this process of fading. As our bodies have aged, the distinction between our abnormalities and the natural decay of the human form has blurred. We have become, in the most literal sense, like everyone else. We have reached that stage of life where the physical does not matter as much as the narrative we have crafted for ourselves. The questions that once haunt us, what are you? How did this happen? Have been replaced by the quiet acknowledgement of you have seen much. We think back to the patrons who used to crowd the front rows, their eyes darting with that nervous, predatory hunger. Where are they now? Their certainty has likely long since crumbled. The world they were so sure of, the world that needed to categorize us to feel stable, has vanished. They too were victims of different kind of performance. The performance of being proper, the performance of being superior. They spent their lives playing roles that were just as confining, just as artificial, and just as doomed to obsolescence as our own. We have realized that the liberation we sought was not something given to us by a social reform or a political act. It was something we grew into. It was the slow, steady cultivation of our own inner lives until they became large enough to dwarf the halls that once contained us. We have filled our days with simple things: the smell of coal smoke in the crisp morning air, the taste of black tea, the sound of the city awakening, the quiet companionship of those who understand the language of our silence. These are not the activities of a wonder, they are the activities of a human being, and that, ultimately, is the highest form of defiance. Every breath we take in private, every moment we spend unobserved, is a victory over the entire logic of the Victoria exhibition. We are the survivors of an era that wanted to turn us into myths, and instead we have become witnesses to the truth. The world is moving on, the gears of the new century are turning, and we are finally, mercifully, fading in the background of a history that no longer requires us to be anything other than what we are. The fog of the new century is lifting, and for the first time we do not feel the need to hide within it. As we walk through London now, we are no longer looking for escape routes or quiet corners to vanish into. The city has become a mirror, but it no longer reflects the distorted images of the exhibition hall. It reflects a multitude of faces, each etched with the unique, complex, and unrepeatable history of an individual life. There is a profound, almost musical quality to the way the city has changed. Where there was once the discordant noise of the barker and the nervous, judgmental murmur of the crowd, there is now the steady, rhythmic pulse of millions of lives moving in concert. We have learned that the true normal is not a uniform state, but a collection of difference that, when viewed from a distance, form a common chord. We watch the younger generation, those who never knew the inside of a Burgundy hall, and we see a spark of something that was missing in the Victorian era, the ability to reckon once in the other. When a child sees someone who is different today, they do not reach for a coin to pay for a closer look. They reach for understanding, a simple acknowledgement of shared existence. This is the death of the freak, not through debate or law, but through the simple, quiet evolution of the human heart. We realize that our presence in this city was not a failed experiment in humanity. It was the catalyst for this very evolution. By forcing the world to look at us, and by fusing to be the monsters they demanded, we made them look at thems. We forced them to confront the limitations of their own empathy, and in that confrontation they were forced to grow. As we reach the final days of our journey, we find us surrounded by a world that is no longer ours in the sense of being a captive audience. It is ours because we are woven in the very fabric of it. We are the neighbours, the workers, the observers, and the contributors. We have reclaimed the right to our own bodies and our own stories. The stage, the velvet, and the gaslight are all distant, fading memories. We are no longer the other. We are the we. The story of the whole has ended, and the story of the individual has begun. There is no more performance, no more spectacle, and no more forced roles. There is only the long winding of the 20th century, and we are finally free to walk it as we truly are, simply, inevitably, and unapologetically human. The gaslights of the Victorian era have long been replaced by the steady, white hum of electric bulbs, and the heavy coal-choked air of London has begun to thin as the 20th century finds its footing. We sit now in a small room, the walls painted a simple, unassuming colour. No longer the oppressive burgundy of our youth. There is no stage here. There is no audience waiting for a performance. There is only the quiet rustle of the morning paper and the sound of the city moving forward outside our window. We have spent our lives fighting for a right that seems so simple now that it is almost absurd, the right to be uninteresting. We fought to lose our status as curiosities, to shed the labels that society plastered onto our skin, and to finally disappear into the vast churning crowd. In the beginning, we saw this disappearance as a loss. We thought that if we were not extraordinary in the eyes of others, we would cease to exist. We were wrong. It was only when we disappeared from the gaze of the public that we began to truly exist for ourselves. We realize now that the exhibition halls were not merely buildings, they were a mindset. They were the belief that human life could be measured, categorized, and commodified. By refusing to conform to that mindset, we didn't just escape a room, we helped to dismantle a worldview. We are the living evidence that no human life is an object to be appraised, and no existence is a spectacle to be consumed. As we look at our hands, hands that have written these words, hands that have weathered the storms of a century, hands that are now finally resting, we feel no need to justify our presence in this world. We are not wonders, we are not monsters, and we are certainly not victims. We are individuals who have claimed our right to a quiet, private, and unscripted life. The stage is dismantled, the velve has rotted, and the history books will likely forget our names, and that is the ultimate victory. We have returned to the earth, to the ordinary, and to the freedom of the unknown. The curtain has fallen not on our lives, but on the error that sought to define them. We are finally, and for the first time, simply ourselves. The story ends here, not with a flourish or a grand proclamation, but with the soft, steady breath of a new jay, a jay that belongs to no one but us. The transition from the spotlight to the shadows of a common life was not a sudden plunge into darkness, but a gentle fading in the twilight of anonymity. For those of us who spent years performing the exceptional, there was a profound disorientation in having nowhere to be and no one to impress. We had been trained to expect a reaction, a gasp, a shudder, a coin dropped in a tray, but now, when we walked down the street, there was only the indifferent rush of the city. This indifference was the most precious gift we had ever received. In the silence of our private rooms, we began to reclaim the parts of ours that had been stripped away by the gaze. We stopped measuring our worth by the reactions of others. We started reading poetry, not to entertain an audience, but to understand our own souls. We cooked simple meals, not to be looked at, but to be nourished. We realized that our humanity was not something to be displayed. It was something to be lived, felt, and guarded. We watched the world outside our windows change. The horse-drawn carriages gave way to the steady hum of motor cars, and the flickering gaslights were replaced by the clean, steady brilliance of electricity. But these technical marvels were not the true progress. The true progress was the fact that the butcher, the baker, and the clerk who lived in the flat downstairs never asked us about our past. They saw a neighbour, not a specimen. They offered a nod of recognition, not a stare of curiosity. We had achieved the ultimate subversion. We had made ours uninteresting to a society that demanded we be sensational. By living quietly, by aging naturally, by being unremarkable, we had effectively deleted ours from the list of curiosities. We were no longer part of the spectacle. We were part of the scenery. and in the vast, complex, and beautiful landscape of the new century, we found that there is no greater power than the ability to simply exist, unobserved and undisturbed. The show is over, the theatre is closed, and for the first time in our lives, the world has finally stopped looking at us and started looking elsewhere. As the new century matured, we observed a fascinating phenomenon. The very stories that were once used to exploit us were being rewritten by the hands of historians, scientists, and writers who were not driven by the hunger for sensation, but by a desire for accuracy. The freak show was no longer a thriving industry. It was becoming a subject of study, a dark chapter in the history of Victorian morality. The journals that once splashed our faces across their front pages with sensationalist headlines were now publishing dry, clinical accounts of the exploitation that had taken place within those burgundy walls. We found a peculiar sense of peace in this academic interest. It felt as if the world was trying to clean its memory, to categorize our suffering not as entertainment, but as a cautionary tale. While the clinical language of these reports was often cold, sometimes stripping us of our humanity just as surely as the showman once did, it at least removed the element of mockery. We were no longer characters in a grotesque tragedy. We were data points in a narrative of social evolution. We spent many hours in the public library that was springing up across London, watching as the youth of the new century pored over these texts. They did not have that predatory glint in their eyes that we remembered from the crowds in the 8880s. They read with a furrowed brow, a look of genuine confusion, and occasionally empathy. The realization began to dawn on us that our legacy was not that we were wonders, but that we were the generation that had been sacrificed to teach the next how to behave. This is the bittersweet reality of progress. We were the anomaly that forced the boundaries of human tolerance to expand. We were the grit in the gears of the Victorian machine. And as those gears were replaced by the smoother, more sophisticated mechanisms of the new age, our importance as symbols began to fade. We realized that our true value was not in the difference that they had forced us to exhibit, but in the silence we kept while they were forced to grow up around us. We are entering a stage where our personal stories are starting to less than the collective progress we helped spark. There is a deep, resonant sadness in this, but also a profound liberation. To be forgotten is to be finally unburdened of the weight of being a wonder. We are becoming ghosts in the machine of history, unseen, unremarked, yet essential to the way the world understands itself. The transition is nearly complete. We have walked out of the halls of the past and in the quiet library, lit halls of the future. And for the first time, we do not feel the need to look over our shoulders to see if the audience is still watching. They have finally and mercifully looked away. There is a cruel yet beautiful irony in the way time treats a body that was once a source of public obsession. For decades, our physical presence was the subject of intense, often predatory, scrutiny. Our limbs were measured, our features catalogued, and our very essence debated by the curious masses. We were hyper, real, frozen in the amber of the audience's gaze, but as we stepped in the twilight of our lives, that intensity began to dissolve. Time, the most relentless of sculptors, has been working on us with a steady, indifferent hand, smoothing out the sharp edges of our otherness and layering us with the universal map of aging. We have found that as our bodies falter, as our movements slow and our skin yields to the inevitable lines of the years, we are finally being granted the grace of invisibility. We are no longer the wonders that caused heads to turn in the crowded streets of the East End. We are just old people sitting on park benches, watching the pigeons flutter in the grey London light, or waiting for the omnibus with the same weary patience as the rest of the city. There is a profound quiet power in this. To be seen as merely old is to be seen as human, for ageing is the one experience that binds all of humanity together in a common fading journey. We look back at the young men and women of the new century, so full of their own frantic energy and certainties, and we feel a detachment that is almost serene. They do not know the history we carry in our bones. They do not see the scars of the Burgundy halls. They only see the stoop of our shoulders and the silver in our hair. In their eyes, we are not symbols of anything other than the quiet passing nature of existence. And this, we realize, is the ultimate victory over the exhibition. The freak show need us to be timeless, to be fixed in a perpetual state of anomaly, but we have insisted on our right to change, to decay, and to grow old. In this decline, we have found a peace that the spotlight never offered. We are no longer fighting the gaze of the spectre. We are simply existing in the rhythm of the city. Our bodies have become our own again, private, fragile, and entirely ours to inhabit. The public's curiosity has withered, replaced by the natural, respectful apathy of a society that has moved on to its own anxieties. We are finally, unequivocally, part of the landscape. The marks of our history are still there, hidden beneath the folds of our clothing and the lines on our faces, but they no longer invite the question, "What are you?" They only suggest the answer, "I am someone who has been here and who is now finally ready to leave." The end, when it approaches, does not come with a trumpet blast or the dramatic falling of a curtain. It comes with the quiet stillness of an autumn evening in London, where the fog rolls in from the Thames and blurs the lines between the stone buildings and the grey, heavy sky. We have spent our lives resisting the definition of others, fighting against the labels that sought to shrink our humanity into mere side-sow attraction. But now, as the final years of our journey settle upon us like fine cold dust, we find that the struggle has lost its urgency. We no longer care to be remembered. We no longer crave the validation of being understood. We have learned that to be remembered is, in a way, to be trapped forever in the version of yours that the world chose to see. To be forgotten is to be granted the most profound mercy of all, the freedom to have never existed in the eyes of the public. We are content to vanish. We are content to let the archives crumble, the letters burn, and the names fade from the registers. Our story is not a monument to be admired. It is a whisper that has served its purpose and is now ready to dissolve into the silence of the city. We look at the younger generation passing us by on the cobbles, men and women, driven by the frantic electric promise of the 20th century. They have no room in their heads for the monsters of the Victorian past, and we are grateful for that. Their indifference is our liberation. We have watched the world shed its skin, discarding the superstitions and the cruel curiosities of the old empire, and in that shedding we have also been allowed to discard our own burdens. In these final quiet days, we find ourselves surrounded by the simple enduring beauty of existence, the warmth of a cup of tea, the gentle rhythm of the rain against the window pane, the way the light catches the dust motes in the air. These are the things that matter, not the applause, not the whispers of the crowd, not the distorted reflections in the glass of the exhibition halls. We have achieved a state of grace where we are no longer the afflicted or the anomaly. We are simply here, and here is enough. As we sit in the deepening twilight, we realize that we are not leaving anything behind because we never truly owned the space we occupied in their world. We were merely passing through a transient ripple in the long dark river of history. We have played our part, the part of the grit that forced the world to change, And now the stage is empty. The silence is not lonely, it is a sanctuary, completely and without a trace, into the vast beautiful anonymity of the human experience. The fog has finally swallowed the last remnants of the Burgundy Hall, and the city of London moves forward with a relentless, humming vitality that has no need for the ghosts of the 19th century. We sit in our quiet room, listening to the chime of a distant clock, counting down the last seconds of a story that has spanned lifetimes. The paper before us is yellowed, the ink is fading, and our hands, those same hands that were once held up for the inspection of strangers, are now still. There is no more to say. The struggle has been won, not with a victory parade, but with the quiet victory of being ignored. We have outlived the prurience of the public, the greed of the showman, and the rigid classifications of the physicians. We have outlived the need to explain ourselves, to justify our existence, or to beg for the dignity of being seen as human. We have reached the state of total, absolute grace, the state of being no be at all. When we step out one last time in the streets, the air feels crisp and new, unburdened by the soot of the old furnaces or the heavy weight of the past. We walk past the places where we once performed, and we do not look back. There is nothing there but empty stone, and the ghosts of a curiosity that has long since starved to death. The world has grown up, and in its growth it has left the freak behind in the dustbin of history. We are not angry, we are profoundly, deeply grateful. We are finally, fully, irrevocably ordinary. We have surrendered our status as monsters to become what we always were, people. We have dissolved into the crowd, becoming the beat of a heart in the rhythm of the city, a flicker of light in the evening haze, a breath of wind in the narrow alleys. The story that began with a scream for attention ends with the soft, peaceful sigh of release. The stage is empty, into the vast, bright potential of the coming century. The lights are out, the velvet has turned to grey ash, and we are finally truly free. We are the silence that follows the applause, the stillness that precedes the morning, and the shadow that finally, at long last, finds its peace in the light. The journey is over, we have arrived, we are simply ourselves, and that is enough. Sleepy History with Benedict is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.